Okay, so how do you... Welcome, fellow Storm Riders. You are officially a rider on the Hypnotic Storm. And welcome to session number 49 of Brain Software with Mike Mandel, and I'm Chris Thompson. As usual, he grows broccoli in his kitchen, he's in love with his Blendtec blender, and he believes Zinfandel is the perfect match for barbecued ribs. Please welcome to the center of the hypnotic world epicenter, the Hypnotic Renaissance Man, Mike Mandel.
Thank you, Chris. Good to be here again. And yes, I am growing broccoli. I'm sprouting it for its anti-cancer and nutritional properties. I am also in love with my Blendtec blender and make a pint of green juice every day. And you're also correct. When I was the wine writer, or one of the wine and music writers for City Bites magazine, I emphasized the importance of the Zinfandel grape, which is actually Croatian, not Californian. And it is identical to the Primitivo grape and goes flawlessly with ribs. If you're cooking barbecued ribs, either pork or beef, add a bottle of Zin to it, a good California Zin. It will be a match made in heaven.
One of my favorite grapes, absolutely. And you know what? Sprouting, you're the one who got me into sprouting and broccoli is one of my favorite seeds to sprout. It's just delicious.
And on to hypnosis, NLP,
right,
and similar things.
Let's talk about all kinds of fun stuff today. So let's start with one of the things that we covered in podcast 48 was metaphors. We spent quite a long time talking about metaphors, and you gave some examples. And then at the end of the podcast, as is always the case, you delivered a therapeutic metaphor about the MEPS fishing lure. And after we were done, you said, you know what? Maybe in the next podcast, I can explain to people how that works.
I did say that, yeah.
And there's a special reason here, right? Because in this particular case, that metaphor does not have a meaning that you can then wreck later, at least a few weeks later.
Right. I mean, if you start to look into it, you're not going to deconstruct it and spoil it in the same sense of another metaphor.
Right. And so maybe a quick recap of why most of the time you would not explain a metaphor to someone.
Right. Well, you're not going to explain a metaphor because you're basically using the metaphor as a piece of brain software to write a program to access the person's unconscious mind and cause untold changes to occur beneath the surface, beneath the threshold of daily awareness, which will be hopeful, beneficial to them. And if you explain it, you then bridge the conscious to the unconscious mind. The conscious mind gets involved and screws it up royally or just stops it working. In this case, the metaphor of the MEPS lure, which is an absolutely true story. Steve Warr is a friend of mine still, and I've known him since I was 17. He lives in British Columbia now, and he's an amazing fisherman and an unbelievable guitarist. And he did cast into the water that day, and the whole catching the MEPS lure actually happened. It was the most remarkable thing. But it's not designed to cause a change in people. Like some of my metaphors, a lure story or a ghost story or a stuck in an island story, some of these are to engender a very specific state rather than a process. So I'm not trying to get someone to do something or change or look at their life in a new way. With these metaphors, I'm endeavoring to access a specific state, which in this case is curiosity.
An empowering state.
Absolutely.
So the state has to have a purpose, and that purpose is to cause you to feel some sort of empowerment.
One to feel a degree of empowerment.
To make your life better.
Yes, that's right. So
that was one
curiosity is a great state to be in. Kids in states of curiosity are wonderful. Their learning goes through the roof. And the same with adults as well. If we maintain a state of curiosity for long periods of time, it makes learning effortless because in a state of curiosity, as John Grinder told me, all our sensory channels become vacuum cleaners.
Okay, so that is fundamentally the purpose behind the MEPS fishing lure story, is to invoke a state of curiosity in the listener, which will do what for them?
Well, it calls them to go out and buy a MEPS lure. This is starting to sound like a freaking MEPS commercial. Why I prefer MEPS to Rapala. Some say Rapala. And why do they say that? Well, they're wrong. So it just, you might want to create a state for specific purposes. And that metaphor will certainly do that. It opens our minds to the possible, to things that we had not thought of. It enriches our map of the world.
That's right. I remember you said that to me. It opens your mind to what's possible. And so it gets you to maybe think outside of the box, or perhaps if you're struggling with some sort of problem, it might inspire you to find a new way to solve the problem that you hadn't thought about before.
Absolutely. All great things to do by being in a specific state. Now, metaphors can go in so many strange turns, Chris. I haven't discussed this with you, but one person sent me an email about 10 days ago, and he wanted to know if I am the real-life Dennis Bryce Morgan, and you are the Henry Squatter of my life. And I said, no, absolutely not. I said, Chris's head is still attached to his shoulders.
Yes.
It's not Henry Squatter.
As far as I'm aware, it is.
No.
Now, that said, there are quite a few people who are upset about having killed off these characters.
I know. But fortunately, we can return to pre-death stories.
Well,
There's
sure.
a million of them.
Well, sure, since you make them all up. I mean, you can do whatever you want.
There is that.
Oh.
So what's next on the agenda?
You wanted to talk about willpower.
Yes, I did. This is actually something that my wife brought to my awareness, and it's a very, very interesting thing. She is
tell.
Thank you. She's a phenomenal researcher and combs the web every day, just finding intriguing things and bits of interest for me. In fact, she's the one who found for me a thing I mentioned a number of podcasts ago, a long time ago, about how if you put your hands to the sides of your head and wiggle your fingers until you can just barely see them appearing in the field of your vision, if you move them back, they disappear. Notice there is no boundary there between what you don't see and what you do. And then you say, well, what is beyond that?
That's wild.
And it's, if you check, there's nothing beyond it. It's not black. It's nothing. People say, well, what color is it beyond? It's nothing. There is simply nothing there.
I have a vague recollection of that podcast.
Right. Well, she found that. Well, she found me another one that's really interesting. A whole way of looking at the world. Remember, this is just a model. So all you young psychologists needn't write in to correct me. It's just a model. It's a way of looking at the world. And the whole aspect we're looking at is the idea of willpower. And people say they need more willpower, or they don't have enough willpower, or they're very strong-willed. Remember I told you about the man, I was at a wine function in my alter ego a number of years ago at one of the downtown hotels, and a man who ran a Toronto restaurant said, what do you do? And I said, I teach hypnosis for groups at the University of Toronto. And he said, well, I can't be hypnotized. I've got too strong a mind. And I said, sucks to be you.
Yeah, that's
Walked
right.
away. Now, this guy, he missed the whole point. So he thought that his will was so great that he could not go into a trance. Well, of course, nothing. It has absolutely nothing whatever to do with it. But this whole study of willpower led to some interesting thoughts. And the article she gave me was discussing how it's easier once you're awake and functioning. And I don't function in the morning, as many of you probably know. I have to sit there with the first cup of coffee quietly swearing for the first half hour.
With like one or two neurons firing.
Right, one or two neurons firing, just running my heart and my lungs. And after quietly swearing for half an hour, I gradually become functional. Every morning it's the same. But then, once you are fully awake, then you have willpower to do the tasks of the day. And the theory basically states, in part, that you have a finite amount of willpower each day. If you see it as a storage, an electrical charge in that Tesla you've just bought, and that is all that you have for the day. So suppose you use your willpower. Now, the indication is you are using your willpower whenever you do something you do not want to do.
Right.
You have to engage willpower to make it happen.
Like going to see that movie you've been looking forward to doesn't count.
Doesn't count at all. But making that
willpower.
phone call to that person you have to fire and don't want to fire, that is huge willpower.
Or for somebody, it could just be something as simple as vacuuming their house.
Right.
I just don't like doing that.
Do it. So they have to use willpower to get it done. And the problem is, as the day goes on, you are using up your tank of willpower. My wife always said she doesn't like to do anything that's serious beyond 7 p.m. because she's a morning person. She wakes up wide awake like 5 o'clock on Saturdays, which is insane and evil. And she wakes up without quietly swearing for half an hour, which is very odd to me. Now, as the day goes on, her willpower starts to fade. Not feeling physically tired, but the willpower fades. And I found it's a really useful model because in my own case, if I don't do a workout in the morning before lunch, every hour past lunch decreases the likelihood that I will do it.
Yeah, that's true. And in fact, if you get too close to lunch hour, then you're hungry.
And then you don't want to do it.
And you don't want to do it. So this is really an interesting model. And again, to re-emphasize again that this is.
You said re-emphasize.
Yeah, I said it in two different ways. I was just being the Department of Redundancy Department.
Director, I meant redundancy detector. Sorry, we'll edit that out.
Of course. We haven't used that joke in a while.
No, I know.
So if you were to treat willpower like it's a
resource.
And it's like a bank account or whatever. You have a finite amount of it. Maybe some people are going to say, you know what, for me, I find I don't really have any in the morning. I have easier access to it at night. I mean, for me personally, that's not the case. I agree with the model.
Yeah.
My life fits with the model, which is that I tend to run out of it as the day goes on. I'm much more liable to do things that I wouldn't want to ordinarily do earlier in the day.
Yeah, I think as a general model, it holds true for most people. And again, most is only 51%. But generally speaking, I think it fades as the day goes on. So now the question comes out, how does one increase their willpower? And can it be done? And yes, it can.
Okay, so how do you do it?
Graphotherapeutically speaking, which is using the strokes of handwriting to send a feedback loop to the prefrontal cortex, can be used to change a wide variety of aspects of the personality.
Letter T, for example.
Letter T, the small letter T is exactly right, Chris. And the small letter T will indicate, according to Milton Bunker and others, the amount of willpower you have, among other things. And that is determined by the weight or thickness or heaviness, whichever what you want to call it, of the bar in the small letter T. So if it's a faint bar,
the horizontal stroke,
if it's faint, or let's say it's the same as the weight of the writing, the thickness of the writing, it's considered moderate. But if your writing is very light and you have a very heavy, thick horizontal stroke through your T's, that is phenomenal willpower. You really want to ensure that you are making the bar of the small letter T heavier weight, press down harder, and make it longer and even slightly upward angle. Because if you do that, you increase simultaneously willpower, you increase persistence of will, which is enthusiasm, which is a leadership trait, and you also add positiveness and optimism, at least as far as most people will find, provided you don't put it on an acute angle so sharp that it becomes stupid. But a slight upward slant on the writing or a slight upward slant on the T-bar will add optimism to the personality, the positive attitude. And by putting these three together and also raising the bar of the T, putting it higher, you increase your self-esteem and your life goals. So,
and it must be from left to right.
Left to right, the T-bar. If it's right to left, regardless of whether you're left or right-handed, right to left is willpower directed against self. And anytime I see a T-bar that is right to left, and you can tell from the stroke by looking at it with a magnifying glass, most of the time it will feather out where you remove the pen from the paper. Right to left is willpower directed against self. Every time I see that, the person has an internal critical voice that rips them apart or criticizes them all the time. And they can often get rid of that or quiet its nagging quality by simply making the T-bar from left to right over time.
This is a really fascinating area for me because I had a very bad habit a long time ago, which I've corrected, of crossing my T-bars from right to left. And I thought that that was because I'm left-handed. And you told me, no, it isn't.
No, there's no correlation.
And, I mean, can I prove that there's a cause-effect relationship here? No. But can I definitely validate that since changing my handwriting, it has changed the way I talk to myself? Absolutely.
Yes. So remember to add all of these elements. All of you listening, spend 5 or 10 minutes a day journaling or writing on a scrap piece of paper and throwing it out. Make your T-bars higher up on the stem, not past the stem, higher up on the stem than you normally do if they're quite low. Make them on a slight upward slant. Make them longer than you normally would and press down harder. And you'll build in all of those wonderful traits of enthusiasm, stronger willpower, higher self-esteem, setting your goals higher in life, and optimism as well. And you will be off to the metaphorical races. It will start to build into your personality if you do it consistently.
In fact, quick commercial break. In September, you are teaching a weekend-long course on graphoanalysis.
My Graphology 101 course draws from the best of American graphoanalysis, which I'm certified in, and also European methods, which I've studied extensively as well. So we'll give you, even though they're two different methods, they interlock perfectly. They are not contradictory. They're complementary. And you come and study with me at the University of Toronto, a weekend-long course. We taught it as a one-day course last year. It sold out. People were passionate about it and said, I feel like I've got psychic powers now. I glance at writing. I know what people's weird sexuality is or whether they steal or lie. And instantly you'll pick this up. So we were so overwhelmed by the response, we made it 2 days instead of one. And that is September 2014.
You can check it out on the website, MikeMandelHypnosis.com, and you'll find all the information there to sign up.
But we should just jump in, Chris, and say we still have some spots for the Mindscaping course.
That's right, which is in June.
Also at the University of Toronto, a weekend-long course. Mindscaping is my own particular method of getting into the unconscious mind of another person. If you're a therapist, a counselor, a social worker, a personal coach, a business leader, whatever, you'll find this remarkable methodology without formal hypnosis for getting into the unconscious mind of another person and landscaping it and making phenomenal changes in their life. That's one weekend again in June 2014.
In fact, the name mindscaping really comes from the idea of a metaphor of landscaping in the mind.
Yes, and the results have been absolutely amazing.
Right. So check it out on the website. Again, you'll find all of the live courses that Mike's teaching at MikeMandelHypnosis.com.
Oh, Chris, let me just add, with mindscaping, this is really handy if you're a therapist or a hypnotherapist because it enables you to earn a pretty good living never leaving your home because you can do mindscaping very, very well over Skype. And I do it all the time. The person pays you by PayPal 24 hours in advance, and you can then work with them the next day and make phenomenal changes in their life.
Absolutely. It is a great system. I encourage all of you to check it out on the website. Now, let's move on to a question that has come up that I think is a really good one. Now, on these podcasts and in live hypnosis trainings, we've talked a lot about things like how to overcome addiction. So in the case of alcoholism, one of the things, did I say it? That sounded weird. Alcohol. It sounded like I said alcohol. Whatever.
It did sound. You sounded like an alcoholic.
Yeah, there we go. It's alcoholism.
Don't take on the.
You admit, I think it was
the physiology.
Yeah,
of the
there we
problem.
go.
Don't go second position.
So for alcoholism, you've talked. I think it was Tad James who said, am I correct in saying that?
No, you're not.
Who was it who said it's more difficult?
Ballmer.
Derek Ballmer, thank you. It's very difficult to take someone who is an alcoholic and turn them into a non-drinker forever.
What he actually said was, Derek said he never changed alcoholics into non-drinkers, ever.
Okay.
He had a very good success rate transforming alcoholics into social drinkers.
Right, because the idea of never being able to do something again is often overwhelming for people, so they're setting themselves up for failure.
It becomes a pressure cooker. As soon as it's never again, I'll never eat pizza again. I'll never eat it again. And 2 weeks later, you have a slice. You go, oh, well, screw it. And then you eat the whole pizza because I've lost it. Now I've blown it. I might as well eat the large pizza myself. Saying never again, it can be a very difficult thing.
Okay.
So it can cause problems. But one of the things, anybody listening, if you have a drinking problem, one of the things you might want to experiment with is this. And I've had pretty good results with it working with people. Alcoholics Anonymous, if you check, you'll find they don't have quite the success rate they claim or seem to have. But one of the things they say that is noteworthy is they say the times that people typically overdrink are when they are very tired, when they're very hungry, or when they are lonely. Now, that's really interesting because all of those things, if we take loneliness as a form of feeling down and depressed and look at it in those terms, all three of those things, tired, hungry, and depressed or lonely, feeling down, can be symptomatic of low blood sugar. And one of the things you can do is if you have a drinking problem, recognize people do all of their behaviors to feel better. Everything everybody does, they want to feel better. No one's any different with that. No one wants to feel worse. And by drinking, it changes your state. And the problem with alcoholics is they don't realize after that first drink, no matter how many you drink, you won't feel any better. That initial rush does not get any greater. You just get more drunk. So one of the things you can do is eat sufficient protein 4 times through the day. If you have protein with breakfast, lunch, again in the afternoon, and again at dinner time, your blood sugar will tend to stay consistent, and you will not have that same urge a lot of the time to drink to try to rapidly draw glucagon out of your liver, raise your blood sugar, and so on.
Okay. That's good advice. I think it makes a lot of sense in terms of making some of the dietary changes that will encourage a healthier lifestyle. So what I want to ask you is about alcohol versus something like smoking, so Derek Ballmer would always work with an alcoholic and turn them into a social drinker rather than a non-drinker.
Right.
Whereas when we talk about smoking cessation, we typically talk about never smoke again. And we use the lines, how many banks do you need to rob
to become a bank robber?
One. Yeah. And how many cigarettes do you need to smoke to be a smoker?
One.
Well, I mean, we are, obviously, somebody who has smoked once when they were 12 and, just because their friend said, hey, try this, and then they never became a smoker. Well, that doesn't really fit the model, I guess. But anyway, that put aside, how are the two different, or are they different? Are they the same?
That's a good question. Any sort of physiological addiction, you can be over it in a week if you're off it. Even heroin, you go off it for 6 days. The 7th day, you're essentially free, and the rest is behavioral. Now, I believe, this is purely my opinion, alcohol addiction is not an addiction to alcohol, or as some people say, an allergy to alcohol or any of these things. It is an emotional addiction to the rush and the changing of the state you get from it. All right? So when you enable yourself to change your state without the alcohol, to feel better without it, then there's no need for it. And I know people will go through horrific withdrawal and that. Nobody can deny people get the DTs and these things. I'm speaking in very general terms. Again, this is only my opinion. Smoking, however, although it does change your state by shifting your breathing, so try it without the cigarettes and you'll find you probably get the same result. There can be a nicotine withdrawal from it where people feel like they're climbing the walls or want to climb the walls and go a bit crazy. With alcohol, I've seen it managed where people can cut down to a couple of glasses of wine a day and it not be a problem anymore. But I have not seen it where people can become a social smoker. By and large, it tends to creep up again.
Okay, so some of this may be science-related, and some of this is simply
Behavioral,
learning
changing your state.
observation and noticing that we haven't really seen people be successful at becoming social smokers.
No, I haven't. I think they go on to become smokers.
Yes.
Because that's what they are.
Okay. So again, this is one of these situations where it's a model, just like we talked about with willpower. This is not absolute.
It's not carved in stone.
Yeah, it's not absolute reality. It's
We're
a model.
talking in general principles here.
Okay, so that's a helpful answer. I thought that was an interesting question. I thought it would be worth talking about on a podcast. And
well, it's good, Chris. Yeah. It's interesting to me how people frame these problems as well. I have a friend who is absolutely a pothead. He cannot stop smoking dope. He does it all the time.
Oh, yes.
And he's becoming duller and doesn't realize he forgets everything. He's becoming stupider, but he's still convinced it's a mind-expanding drug and that it's good for him and justifies it through a million different ways. But he's not addicted to it. He's not addicted.
Of course not.
But he can't go a single day without it. Well, why should he? It's not addictive and it's not a problem. He shouldn't have to go without it.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like oxygen. Right?
Yeah. Unbelievable.
All right, let's move on from that one. Let's talk about post-hypnotic suggestions. Now,
there's a jump.
I want to pre-frame this a little bit. There are a lot of people who listen to this podcast. They find it because they are searching on a variety of topics, and they find it very fascinating because I think we actually do a really good job of blending just general interesting stuff, general interest information, cool stuff, but also always bringing it back to hypnosis and NLP and
brain enhancement.
What's going to be fascinating to people who want to learn more about hypnosis. And one of those things, when people learn about hypnosis, they hear about it or they see it, they feel like the idea of a post-hypnotic suggestion, something that a hypnotist says to someone that is in a hypnotic state, that will be an instruction for them to carry out later, a post-hypnotic suggestion, that it's some kind of magical thing, magical power. And I thought we should talk about that a bit more because we do get a fair number of questions on that topic. So let's
I need you to clarify it a bit more, Chris. What are you actually asking me about it?
Well, let's talk about it. And I want you to explain, is there anything magical about a post-hypnotic suggestion?
Well, it's certainly not magic, but it can seem that way. It can certainly be very, very scientific and cause some phenomenal results. Working at the Ontario Police College years ago, they were teaching a particular seminar the next day that I won't go into, but the bottom line was one of the people who was going to be in the class was on my stage, and I've hypnotized more cops than any other demography. And they got me to hypnotize this guy and give him a suggestion that he would carry out the next day in class. And he was to jump up on his desk while the instructor was teaching this very serious problem course.
Oh, man.
And yell at the instructor. And again, it's inappropriate to tell you what it was. This was their request. I'll tell you off microphone. But anyway, I just got an email our phone call. It was pre-email, and the guy phoned me the next day and just said, he did it. Now, it can seem impossible. When I first messed with or experimented with post-hypnotic suggestion, it was with a man called John Cole, and I hypnotized him when I was in high school. And I never realized, like when we waited several minutes for the trigger to take place, I would get concerned and think, okay, it's taking too long. You know, we haven't had someone walk in the room that's going to trigger this or whatever. It's not going to work if we wait too long. But the reality is there is no degree of time that will undermine a properly set post-hypnotic suggestion. You can literally hypnotize someone and tell them, on April 15th, 2016, you'll awaken at 3 a.m. and phone this number. And if you've done your work properly, they will. It's such a powerful tool that George Estabrooks, in his early days of experimentation for the program that went on to be MK Ultra, working with the CIA and other similar programs, he developed a technique where they could set up a hypnotic courier. So they would put someone in a deep trance, give him all the information he had to carry, so nothing was written down. He'd remember it all and would come out of the trance, and it would be compartmentalized, and you have no recollection of this. Then you would go to Korea or wherever it was, And the doctor at the other end would give him this trigger phrase. He would immediately go back into trance and pass the information on to him. But it was buried behind an amnestic barrier, so he would not know it was there. So, I mean, all done hypnotically, but that was binary. It wasn't just, the phrase would give the information. It was actually the phrase, and that specific doctor had to say the phrase to him. So it's a two-part.
Like a key.
It's a double password, right? And of course, they would, I think, build in things like if the doctor says this other phrase to you, instead it will erase all the material. So it's really, really interesting what can be done, although there is another aspect that there is no degree of amnestic barrier that you can set up that will sufficiently, completely conceal a hypnotic suggestion.
Sort of like deleting a file on a hard drive, and there's always a way to recover it unless you destroy the hard drive.
That's right. We don't want to be doing that.
All right. So let's just go back to this a little bit here. So people who may have seen one of your stage hypnosis shows would be a witness to an obvious post-hypnotic suggestion, which is the termination of the show. Everyone's sent back to the audience, and when the guy, let's say, goes into the washroom, he's going to remember everything that happened on stage. But until that happens, he's going to be sitting in the audience thinking he's waiting for the show to start. And I've witnessed it myself. I've seen a guy, as soon as he walked through the bathroom door, boom, this huge flush of redness.
Yes. And he can't contrive that. That's an unconscious response.
Exactly. So that was an obvious one used in entertainment. But I want also to talk about the fact that let's talk about post-hypnotic suggestions that are used in therapeutic environments as well, because they're really, a post-hypnotic suggestion is just a suggestion or a direction, right?
That is given in a deep or somnambulistic trance that has either a temporal or other trigger to set it off. When I say temporal, meaning at a certain time it will fire, or there's some other, they're anchors. All post-hypnotic suggestions are anchors, but they're very specific ones.
So, for example, let's imagine that a client came to you and said, I want to feel completely different about chocolate bars because I have this addiction to eating chocolate bars. It's ruining my health. It's really the only crutch that I have in terms of sweets, and I want to hate them. Well, you can do hypnotic work with them, and you can directly suggest that they no longer find them appealing. But I suppose you could also give them a post-hypnotic suggestion, and maybe let's talk about whether this would be useful, just to back up the work, that when you do see a chocolate bar, it's going to immediately remind you how unappealing you find them. Something like that.
Yeah, I know what you mean. That's kind of the old way they used to deal with smoking cessation. They'd make them taste terrible. Or when you smoke a cigarette, it'll make you cough your head off. I did that when I was a kid.
Not really a productive thing to have happen.
Get John Cole coughing like so. He's almost coughing his liver out. And it was working, but unless you are removing the benefit, if you're not removing the reason behind the behavior, the secondary gain, it probably isn't going to go away from doing something like that. You need to build in alternate behaviors to really be powerful with
That's a good point. So perhaps a much more useful post-hypnotic suggestion, if you were determined to use one, would be every time you see a chocolate bar, it's going to remind you of how important it is to eat healthier, alternative foods.
Much better.
Something to that effect,
Sure,
right?
Much better. Replace it with something else. Now remember, too, the difference that a lot of people miss between post-hypnotic and continuance of suggestion. And post-hypnotic
I'm glad you brought that up.
is a suggestion given in a deep or somnambulistic trance, which is the working state of hypnosis that will fire at either a temporal or other signal later. The instant the person goes back into that trance, they immediately go to the identical depth of trance they were in when they respond to that trigger.
Right.
So I don't know how I just worded it. I'm reading what you put on the screen at the same time. I didn't listen to myself.
Let me see if I got that right. Okay. I've heard you teach this before, so I should.
See, if I stumbled over my words there, I'm admitting it.
If I screw this up, it'll be rather embarrassing because I've only heard you teach this about 10 times now.
Okay, go ahead.
So when you give somebody a post-hypnotic suggestion at a certain depth of trance, let's call that depth D, that when they then execute the post-hypnotic suggestion, they're going to
do an example.
So let's say
someone knocks at the door.
When someone knocks at the door, you are going to jump on top of the table and yell hallelujah.
Or it doesn't even have to be that crazy. Right. It could be someone knocks at the door, you'll mistake it and think it's the phone ringing.
Sure.
Pick it up and say hello.
And so let's say whatever depth they were in a somnambulistic trance. They were in a deep somnambulistic state at that time. When they execute that trance, so as soon as the knock at the door happens, as they enter that execution of the command, they're going to return to that same depth of trance to execute the suggestion.
Yes, I'm just laughing quietly to myself, thinking how many people don't even seem to be able to get the somnambulistic part right. I remember Don Martin said
somnambulistic,
and Milton, what's his name?
Samuelism.
Yeah.
Oh,
Orman McGill called it Samuelism.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're always like somnambulation. I'm always very careful to enunciate it properly.
Let's say deep trance.
Or because we make fun of the use of the term critical factor.
Oh, don't
I
go
always
there.
slow myself down and make sure I don't say it the wrong way.
Yeah, make sure you don't. I can hypnotize you for that. So we have said that deep trance, you install a suggestion, set off a particular signal, either temporal or actual. The person goes back into the identical depth of trance to complete what the suggestion is, instantly comes out of it. Now, knowing that, you can hypnotize someone, give them a somnambulistic trance, somnambulistic, put them in a trance, and when you have the suggestion fire...
Hijack!
You can hijack it. You want to explain that?
Yeah, so, I mean, you can tell me if I get this correctly
I'll tell you.
not. But if you notice that they are returning into that depth of trance to execute the hypnotic suggestion, you can then enter that trance, or basically hijack that trance by giving them more suggestions and basically building...
If you interrupt them in the middle of the performance...
That's it, you have to interrupt them,
interrupt their pattern when they're attempting to perform the hypnotic suggestion that has been pre-suggested as post-hypnotic, and they're back in trance. If you interrupt them, they will stay in trance and look for resolution. You can now hijack the trance and say and do whatever you want. They will respond.
And they will be in hypnotic rapport with you.
Generally speaking. Now, continuance of suggestion is the other one I alluded to. And that is a suggestion given while someone is in a trance, even a light one, that they carry out with them. So it can be, and you're feeling wonderful now, and you're relaxed again. And when you come out of trance, you can bring all those relaxing, wonderful feelings with you. There's nothing post-hypnotic about that.
And so since we were talking about metaphor, the idea behind this, if we wanted to paint a metaphor, it is you have the person in trance, you're giving them a new tool, and they're taking that tool with them when they leave.
That's right. Well put. That's a good way of looking at it.
All right. I think we're going to wrap up here because we just covered off a great amount of content.
Okay, and in the next podcast, I want to tell the amazing mentalism effect that Bill McClory taught me in 1975 and how you can predict a series of random numbers from an audience. All you need is chutzpah, as my Jewish friends say.
Okay.
Why don't you give the empowering question?
That's going to be podcast 50 then. So before I do the empowering question, next podcast is podcast 50, and we definitely have to do some cool stuff on there.
Yes, and please check out the Mindscaping online at MikeMandelHypnosis.com.
Absolutely.
And look into that for June. We still have some spots left.
We've got a few spots in all of the upcoming classes except for the May hypnosis training, which is totally full.
Sold out for months. Now,
all right,
Chris, tell us.
Here is your empowering question for today. What stories from your childhood inspire a state of curiosity within you? And what are you going to do to explore that even further today? What stories from your childhood inspire a state of curiosity within you? And what are you going to do to explore that even further today?
You know, Chris, a number of years ago, when I was a young boy, actually 7 years old, so 1960, just at the end of the Civil War, my parents and my sister and I drove in a 1953 Ford Meteor from Toronto to Prince Edward Island. A long drive, especially since my parents, being Brits, stopped every 10 minutes to make tea on a portable Coleman stove. So it was an adventure, as my father used to love to say. They always thought inconvenience was adventure. But we got to Prince Edward Island and had a wonderful time eating Prince Edward Island potatoes and the sand dunes that were all red sand and a beautiful part of Canada. And the site of Anne of Green Gables, which is probably more interesting to female readers than to male readers. And so on the way back, we went through Halifax, and it was my first time in that great city, one of my favorite cities on the Atlantic Ocean. Nova Scotia is a wonderful province, and there's a pier in Halifax that is absolutely fantastic to walk around regardless of the weather. And we went as a family, and there were different vendors who were set up on this Saturday morning, and one man had an oyster stand. And I had not eaten oysters. In fact, I didn't eat one until about 10 years ago, whereupon I went crazy for them and now shuck them at home. Kumamoto being my favorite. So we stopped at this stand, and a few people were ordering oysters, and my father liked them, and he liked winkles as well, which you couldn't get there. Never occurred to him you couldn't buy Winkles in Canada, and he'd ordered them at a truck stop in Ohio. Any Winkles? Any Winkles today? They'd look at him like he was insane, and I'd wonder why the waitress could tell he was insane. And I could tell he was insane, but he thought it was completely normal to ask for Winkles in an Ohio truck stop. But back to Halifax Pier. They bought some oysters, at least my dad did. They didn't have any Winkles. And sitting on a bed of ice, open in a shell, was the largest oyster any of us had ever seen. It was huge, the size of your fist. And it looked like it must have been made of rubber. It couldn't be that big and be real, but the man assured everyone it was. And this was back in 1960, and he offered $5 to anyone who could eat that oyster. Just said he would. And my dad looked at it. Now, an oyster, you don't really chew it. You swallow it whole. You want it just to stop struggling on the way down, though. Stomach acid generally puts it into that pretty quickly. And so my dad bet him the $5 he could. He was convinced he could, with his experience with Winkles, I guess, which are quite small. And he took this oyster up in the shell, poured this thing the size of a baseball into his mouth, swallowed it, looked like he was going to turn green, and it came right back up into the shell in his hands. And my dad catch his breath. You could tell he was nauseous and felt horrible. And he said to the man, "I'm sorry." He said, "I really thought I could, but I couldn't keep it down." And the man said, "That's all right, sir. No one's been able to."
Thanks, everybody. This has been Brain Software with Mike Mandel, and I'm Chris Thompson, episode number 49. Make sure that you head on over to our website, MikeMandelHypnosis.com, sign up for the email list because we're going to send you a free copy of Mike's ebook, Brain Software, and it's incredible, full of life-changing stuff. We'll send you a lot of other cool stuff, and leave a review for this podcast on iTunes. There's a link on our website on how you can go and do that. We'd love for you to leave a 5-star rating if you feel we deserve it, but it's most important that you just go there, write a review, and leave your recommendation for others so we can spread the world and increase
Spread the world.
Spread the world, I said. Spread
We'll edit that out.
That's hilarious.
Thanks for tuning in.
Spread the word with the world. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and good night.
He's lived a long time. He's a cat who has lived 3 lives in succession. He was famous in proverb and famous in rhyme, a long while before Queen Victoria's accession. At the sight of that placid and bland physiognomy, he sits by the